The chemicals come from China. The precursor chemicals arrive in big container ships. We were there and filmed it. And then we filmed the lab where they make the drugs. And then we went to the border and filmed them packing the drugs, changing the smell so they weren't detected by dogs. It was really incredible. And then we saw them as they're hiding the drugs inside a car. And then we were allowed to film as a pregnant woman, American, crossed into the US carrying 5 kilos. At the time, I believe it was heroin laced with fentanyl. And she was stopped, and we were stopped right next to her. And they searched her car. And
that's the first one that I watched recently where I was like, this is fucking crazy. Like, how is this on television? The fentanyl one. So, and again, for these episodes, you guys go through the full supply chain and full pipeline in a lot of cases. So can you kind of tell us what you did for that episode?
Fentanyl, yeah. So I've been reporting on the opiate crisis for many years. I started in 2007. So it's been almost 18 years reporting on the opiate crisis. It started with basically OxyContin. We did a story called the OxyContin Express, and it was about how there were these pain clinics in Florida that were dispensing OxyContin like it was candy. And we did the pipeline of OxyContin all the way to Appalachia and saw, this crazy sort of distribution of drugs. And then we realized that all these people that were getting hooked on OxyContin, then when they had trouble finding those pills, they moved on to heroin. So we did a story about heroin abuse. And then after a while, I remember perfectly well, I was in Los Angeles at my house, and I got a call from a drug enforcement contact of mine who called me and said, hey, have you heard of this thing called fentanyl? It's like popping up everywhere. It's a big concern. It's starting to become a big concern for law enforcement. And I'd never heard of fentanyl before. And I did a Google search, and there were some reports of some fentanyl, people dying from fentanyl overdoses, but it was minimal. And again, it wasn't a drug that most people were aware of. And I remember at the time I was working for a television station called Fusion, and I called my boss and I said, hey, I'm hearing things about fentanyl, this drug, and I think there's a story here. And his first reaction was like, nobody knows what fentanyl is, and what are you talking about? I've never heard about this drug. But I persisted, and I kept at it, and I kept telling him, look, nobody knew what OxyContin was when I first reported on it. I'm telling you, if I'm hearing this from my law enforcement contacts, it is going to be big. And eventually he agreed, and our story came out before Prince died of an overdose of fentanyl. And Prince was sort of the first celebrity that really got fentanyl on the map. And people started realizing that year that we did our story was the first time that New Hampshire had more people dying. It was the only state that had more people dying from overdoses of fentanyl than heroin. At the time, again, nobody really knew what fentanyl was. But that statistic alone was, I think, a big wake-up call for people. And that's when our first story about fentanyl came out. And I remember for that story trying really hard to get access to a fentanyl lab in Mexico, and I wasn't able to. We were able to actually film with people involved in the fentanyl trade, but we weren't able to get access to the fentanyl lab itself. And so when Traffic started, first season, I pitched a story on fentanyl because it had grown exponentially. Now everybody knows what fentanyl is. It was killing way more people than heroin or any other drug. So eventually I reached out to my contacts in Sinaloa, and that's how I found myself in a fentanyl lab. But it took months to get that access. And even the days leading up to the filming in the lab were crazy because it was the siege of Culiacan had just happened. So Culiacan had been sort of shut off. It was incredibly dangerous to be in Culiacan. National Geographic didn't want us to be anywhere close to the city. So we had to be in Mazatlan, which is in the south, and had to figure out a way to get access to this area where they were telling us that they were cooking fentanyl. And we spent actually days waiting. We would drive there and get there and wait out in the sun, and they would not show up. And this happened for I think it was 2 full days that we waited for the access. And then finally, at the end of the second day, they finally showed up, and they said, okay, follow us. And they took us, and they opened this door, and there was this sort of abandoned house, and they were cooking fentanyl there, and they showed us the whole process. And it was crazy. Yeah, it was the whole masks and everything. So after filming in the fentanyl lab, we really wanted to see the whole process. So we saw when the chemicals come from China, the precursor chemicals arrive in big container ships. We were there and filmed it, arriving in Mexico, and then we filmed the lab where they make the drugs, and then we went to the border and filmed them packing the drugs. And making it changing the smell so they weren't detected by dogs, and not so that they're not detected in X-ray machines. It was really incredible. And then we saw them as they're hiding the drugs inside a car, and then we were allowed to this day. I'm not sure why or why they gave us this incredible access, but we were allowed to film as a woman. Pregnant at the time, pregnant woman, American as well, crossed into the U.S. carrying 5 kilos. At the time, I believe it was heroin laced with fentanyl. And we were there, and we saw her, and she was stopped, and we were stopped right next to her, and they searched her car. And what was incredible, the things that are going through my mind at the time was, I reported a lot on the opiate crisis, and I've spent a lot of time with the mothers of people who have died from overdoses. And I kept thinking there was something that was making me very uncomfortable about the fact that I was seeing these drugs come across the United States and knowing the harm that they can do. And I felt really uncomfortable. It was a moment that it was one of the hardest moments for me as a journalist, because I kept thinking, the mothers that I've spent time with, how are they going to judge me for being in this position? And my thought also was, what can I do? I can go and tell the police, Border Patrol, that actually this woman is carrying drugs and she will be arrested and they'll confiscate these drugs. And what impact will I have then? Yes, I'll get one person off the streets. Or shall I report on this and show the reality that the vast majority of drugs are coming across through legal ports of entry? And by showing how these drugs make it from A to B, how the process works, hopefully I will show how it's done and, force people to act and try to stop this. And so, yeah, it was a difficult moment. And eventually she makes it across, and we were able to speak to her once we were already in the United States with the drugs. And I asked her, weren't you scared? You were stopped, your car was being searched. Weren't you scared? And she says, oh, no, that guy that was searching my car, oh, I know him well. I come here across all the time. He works for the cartel. And this is why I crossed at this time of the day.
So they're paying off the border agents?
In this case, that's what she told me.
Do you think maybe they might have been telling her that to put her at ease or something?
Corruption in border agent corruption has been reported extensively. There's many cases where that's been the case. Again, it goes back to the amount of money. When we're talking about millions of dollars, it's so much money is easily corruptible, right? It's easy to corrupt somebody with this large amounts of money. So, yeah, we saw it. We saw how easily she got off. Yeah.
So, to your point about kind of being conflicted, again, you live in America, you live in California. You're an American citizen, and you've dealt intimately, as you said, with the moms of these people that have died from the stuff that's being brought across the border. How do you, you're a journalist, right? Mm-hmm. You're there to capture this moment, and we can kind of talk about, in my opinion, the pros of this one outweigh the cons, and there's an element to it. There's nuance to every story, mm-hmm. in my opinion. But what is the line for you? If you're trying to reconcile that in your head, is what would be the line with what you're not comfortable being a journalist for and watching?
Oh, yeah, whenever there's actual harm being done to a human being or an animal. So I've said this many times. So if I know that, for example, people have been kidnapped and I know where those people are, or I know that somebody is about to be killed or tortured or harmed in any way, or an animal is about to be harmed or tortured in any way, and I know that I can, stop that from happening at that very moment, then that's the line. And I think that's the line for the vast majority of journalists. But in terms of shining a light to systemic failures in our government, because that's essentially the beginning of a black market. It's how it all starts. It's the exploitation of systemic failures. That's how, whether you're talking about guns, drugs, fake pills, even scams. So it's my job as a journalist is to sort of see the larger picture and try to expose that larger picture. And I think that's but there's a line. I had a journalism professor once who gave me a really good piece of advice, which is, as journalists, there's always a line, and you don't want to cross that line, but you want to make sure that you come back with chalk on your feet.
Huh. Wow, I love that.
Yeah, me too.
And you do, and you most certainly do.
Very often.
So then, like, going back to, again, like the border. Again, in my opinion on this one, like, I think that the pros, as I mentioned, outweighed the cons for bearing witness to something like that. Because number one, it's a drop in the bucket as far as like how much shit comes across the border every single day. But that's not the point. I think the point is that there's Americans that are making the choice to buy these drugs and put them in their body. Nobody's forcing them to do that. Mm-hmm. So like, again, exposing that, I think, in my opinion, like outweighs the actual cons. But you and the team are the ones that have to live with that, right? So like, how do you think of, okay, so like that was in California, right? You go home that night, like you're having a beer with Darren, like, and you're thinking to yourself, like, what the fuck did I just watch? Like, is there ever a time where you're like, this job is...
Oh, dude, that day that we filmed that woman going across the border and bringing 5 kilos of heroin laced with fentanyl into California, she was bringing them actually to LA. I went straight, we filmed her at the border, we filmed her crossing, we spoke to her, and then she went her way, and I went home, and I didn't go home. I went straight to a soccer practice for my son, who at the time was 6 or 7 years old. And I was with other mothers who were telling me about how crazy their day had been because they had just gone to all these different, soccer and sports practices for their kids. And I was like, I can't even begin to tell you how crazy my day has been. And it was pretty insane. And I remember having a big dinner that night with my husband and my team. I invited my whole team to come to dinner at my house, and us all sharing our stories. I mean, that's one big important part of that I force my team to do is every night after we film or at the end of the day, whenever it is that we finish filming, that I like if we can all get together and share a meal, share some drinks, and talk about the events of that day. Because it isn't always easy, and most often it's not actually easy, and we see some pretty awful shit. And so to be able to just talk about it, it's our own little therapy session, particularly if it's over a glass of wine or beer. I think it's really important.
Definitely, yeah. It's a decompression, right?
Yeah, decompression, and it's our way of like trying to process what just happened. Like, that was one of the days. It's like, holy shit, what did we just do? Is this okay? How are we going to show this on television? And eventually, I did actually reach out to some of the mothers that I'd spoken with, and I shared the story with them, and I was very grateful to them that they were very understanding. And they said, look, at the end of the day, I think your job of explaining and showing what's happening is more important than, getting this pregnant woman in prison. But it's tough. It's really tough sometimes. But I don't think I've ever crossed the line in a way that's made me feel that I shouldn't have done it. It's made me feel I've been very close, and I felt very uncomfortable at times, and I've had many conversations about this. But I don't think I've ever done anything that, looking back, I say, if I'd go back, I'd do it completely different. I don't think it directly affected anyone's life negatively.
What's up, guys? Thank you so much for taking the time to watch the interview. If you got anything out of this video at all, please like the video, leave me a comment, tell me what you thought of the video, tell me who you'd like to see on the show. I really appreciate the support. It goes a long way on these platforms, as you guys know. Most importantly, I have some excellent interviews coming up in the future that I'm really, really excited about. So please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of them. But that's it. Thank you for your support. I really appreciate it, and hope to see you again soon.